Chapter 3 of the Stamp. When stamped, before a bond can be received in evidence, it must have a stamp of the proper value. It is not, however, necessary that this should be done at the time of its execution, but it may be stamped at any period upon payment of the penalty of 5 litres. Unless the bond requires a progressive duty, in which case the penalty is 10 litres. The addition of another obligor after the execution of the bond, but before it has been accepted by the obligee, will not render a fresh stamp necessary, and though several persons are bound for the performance of certain acts by each and every of them, yet the whole being one transaction a single stamp is sufficient. By the schedule of the 55G. 3, c. 184, bonds are arranged under several distinct heads, and the amount of the stamp varies accordingly. But in addition a progressive duty of 5 and 30 shillings is required for every 1080 words above the first 1080. First, bonds given as a security for the payment of a definite and certain sum of money, which require a stamp varying from 1 to 5 and 20 pounds, according to the amount of the sum secured. A bond given for the quarterly payment of an annual rent, is a bond for the payment of a definite and certain sum, though payable at future periods, and therefore falls within this branch of the schedule. 2d. Bonds given as a security for the repayment of thereafter advanced, either with or without any sum already advanced, and if the sum secured by the bond, or to be ultimately recoverable, is uncertain and without limit, a 25 litres stamp is requisite, but if the sum be clearly limited, the duty is the same as on a bond for the payment of such limited amount. In order to ascertain the amount of the stamp required, the condition of the bond, and not the penalty, must be looked to. Since the penalty will not be considered as limiting the amount of the security, without there is an express provision to that effect, and therefore a bond conditioned for securing the payment of money advanced and to be advanced should be stamped as a bond for securing an unlimited sum. So where the condition was to pay any sum of money advanced, not exceeding 1000 litres, together with all such lawful charges and allowances as are usually made by bankers, it was held that a 5 litres stamp was not sufficient. But where the sum to be advanced is clearly limited, as where the condition expressly stipulates that the money to be ultimately recoverable shall not exceed a certain sum, an ad valorem stamp is sufficient. 3d. Bonds given as a security for the transfer of stock, security for transfer of which require the same stamp as a bond for the payment of money equal to the value of the stock on the day of the date of the bond, or on any 10 days preceding. 4th. Bonds for the payment of money secured by mortgage, bearing even date with the bond, or for the performance of covenants contained in the mortgage deed, require only a 1 litre stamp. Where one and the same sum of money was secured by mortgage deed and by bond, which were executed at the same time, but did not bear the same date, and the mortgage deed was impressed with an ad valorem stamp, and the bond with a stamp of 1 litre, it was held the bond was not properly stamped. 5th. Annuity bonds. If the bond is the principal security for the payment of the annuity upon the original creation and sale thereof, it must bear the same stamp as an actual grant or conveyance. If merely a collateral security, given upon the original creation and sale of the annuity, a 1 litre stamp is sufficient. Where the bond is not given at the original creation and sale of the annuity, and the money, not being interest or rent reserved upon a lease, is to be paid at stated periods, so that the total amount can be previously ascertained, the same stamp is required as bonds for the payment of a sum certain. But when the total amount cannot be previously ascertained, an ad valorem duty is necessary. 6th. Bonds given to indemnify any person who has become surety for the payment of money or transfer of stock require a 5 and 30 shilling stamp. Where principal and surety were jointly and severally bound to pay the creditors of a third person 14s in the pound on the amount of their debts, and by the same bond, the principal was bound to indemnify the surety against all loss by reason of his becoming surety, it was held that this bond did not fall within the above description, and that a second stamp was not necessary on account of the obligation to indemnify the surety, the whole being one transaction. And upon the same principle, an agreement stamp is not necessary to an arbitration bond, containing, besides the usual covenants, an agreement as to the payment of costs. 7th, bonds for the due execution of an office require a 5 and 30 shilling stamp. 8th, bonds given in respect of any of the duties of customs or excise require a £1 stamp. 9th, bonds entered into on obtaining a marriage license require a £1 stamp. 10th, administration bonds require a £1 administration stamp. 11th, bond, accompanied with a deposit of title deeds for making a mortgage, must be stamped as a mortgage. 12th, so also any back bond for making redeemable any disposition apparently absolute, but intended only as a security. 13th, all bonds of any kind whatsoever, not otherwise bonds not otherwise charged, nor exempt from stamp duty, require a 5 and 30 shilling stamp. Whereby articles of agreement under seal, the plaintiff agreed to pay the defendant a salary of 35 litres per annum, and the defendant covenanted not to set up a chemist's shop within 1 mile of the plaintiff's, and the plaintiff and defendant were mutually bound in the penalty of 6,001. It was held, that considering this instrument as a bond, it came within the above description, and that a 5 and 30 shilling stamp was sufficient. So a bond to secure damages to be recovered upon a new trial, and the costs of the action, in the event of the result of a second action, is properly stamped with a 5 and 30 shilling stamp. And where a principal and surety were jointly and severally bound for the payment of the debt of a third person, and by the same instrument the principal was bound to indemnify the surety, it was held that the bond came with in the above description, and that a 5 and 30 shilling stamp was sufficient. Certain bonds are expressly exempted from stamp duty, as bonds given by the collectors of taxes, and c. And it has been decided in a late case, that a bond given by the collector of assessed taxes for the due payment of moneys received by him is within the exemption of the above-mentioned Act, notwithstanding the sum thereby secured exceeds the amount of the whole duty to be collected in the district. Endorsements of receipt of money due on bond are also exempted from receipt stamps, and where such endorsements have left no blank space for receipts of subsequent payments to be written on the bond, such receipts on an unstamped piece of paper annexed to the bond are admissible in evidence. The 5 Go. 4, c. 41, has repealed the stamp duty on bail bonds, replevin bonds, bonds by petitioning creditor of bankrupt, and the assignment of all such bonds.